Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We've got folks across many time zones here, so it's better to say probably just good day. I'm Alondra Nelson. I'm president of the Social Science Research Council, and we are delighted to invite you to Reimagining Social Institutions, the first of a series of conversations that the SSRC is proud to be co-sponsoring and collaborating on with Sage Publishing. This is a series of events that aims to provide a space for dialogue between social scientists and colleagues working across the humanities and sciences as well, in addition to advocates and activists, and an opportunity to come together to continue the work of reimagining equitable and anti-racist social institutions. I'm pleased to have as our partner in this endeavor, Sage Publishing, and more importantly, Ziyad Marar, who's the president of Global Publishing at Sage, who's been a great partner in the work of trying to reimagine social science since I began at the SSRC several years ago. Ziyad, I turn things over to you to say a few remarks.
Thank you, Alondra. And hello, everybody. Great to see so many people, as you say, in so many different time zones joining us for what should be a really exciting event. The idea for this series comes out of a whole series of discussions, and I should mention my colleague Katie Metzler, who along with Alondra and I were discussing this kind of concept many months ago. And we're delighted now to see that it's turned into reality, and grateful to our friends at the SSRC and our colleagues at Sage for actually making it happen. For those of us at Sage who've worked with social scientists over the years, we've learned that a social science imagination teaches us to focus on profound but commonly less visible impediments to change. It's easier to see the figure than the contextual ground sometimes. And that insight, that deep aspect of imagination, brings with it a realization that human behavior and outcomes are shaped profoundly by historical, political, and cultural forces, which means that realizing lasting change can mainly come from tackling those structures themselves. And so racism and inequality are just such outcomes, and it's an outrage to see how much more needs to be done. And to me, that sets an ongoing and profound challenge to that social science imagination. And I've been very taken by kind of Alondra's stance and the gauntlet she laid down for the SSRC, saying, can we move beyond analysis and into actually thinking about what can have an impact? And it seems to me particularly fitting then to have a series of events that look to reimagine institutions themselves, look at the structures through which so many of these conditions are reproduced. And so there's no better place to start than with schools. And it's wonderful to have such a superb range of speakers to help us do some reimagining. So with that, I'd like to hand back to you, Alondra. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ziyad. So a bit of housekeeping as we get started. We're going to proceed with, I'm going to make a few remarks, and then each of the speakers will make brief remarks, and we'll have a little bit of discussion amongst the four of us, and then we'll turn to Q&A. So please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to pose your questions. And a reminder that the hashtag for this conversation is hashtag Reimagining Social Institutions. So as Ziyad said, we had started having a series of conversations between our two organizations over the summer about how we might begin to open up a space for a reimagining, indeed, of social institutions. At the SSRC, there were really, there were several kind of touchstones for us that really, I think, compelled us to want to partner on this series and on today's conversation in particular. On April 24th, we launched a platform called COVID-19 and the Social Sciences. And in the course of that, we've brought many scholars, leaders, activists into conversation about how we want to imagine and reimagine society in this kind of post-pandemic moment. And in the course of doing that, we've had a series of short interviews, and I'm going to read you a quote from two people who are two of the three touchstones I want to mention. The first is Spencer Foundation President Naila Swad Nasir, who in a conversation with the SSRC said the following, quote, "We need social science to step into the creative, innovative work of reimagining social institutions," close quote. And a similar conversation with the anthropologist Annalise Riles, who is an associate provost for global affairs and executive director of the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs at Northwestern University here in the United States. She said something similar, quoting her here. It's really important that universities grasp the historic nature of this crisis and open themselves up to reimagining themselves. And the only thing that would really stand in the way of us doing this is not understanding how much is changing all around us until that change has already happened in one direction or another. To me, universities are places in which knowledge is created and transmitted, both from teacher to student and from the university community to those in the world who can use it. We always took for granted that a university was a place with towers, offices, and classrooms where people behave in certain ways. But what if we're in a moment right now where we don't know what a university looks like? Is it a space? Is it not a space? How does the classroom work? What do people learn? How do people communicate? All of that is up for grabs by virtue of the fact that we're in this virtual experiment. Since we have to reimagine everything right now, why don't we just go for it and reimagine it? Close quote. And thirdly, a really profound, I think, third touchstone for this conversation in this series are the intertwined pandemic, economic, and racial crises that we variously been experiencing for more than 9 months, that have brought the fact and the language of structural inequality and institutional racism out of the academy, out of the social sciences more particularly, and into public discourse. So to my mind, this is really compelling us as scholars, as researchers, to really begin to describe, not only describe the edifice of interlocking challenges and opportunities that shape life chances, but also an obligation to change them, to develop a social science for solutions that includes and necessarily must begin with reimagining the very anchors of social life and of the social world, reimagining institutions. So we're delighted to begin this conversation today with a conversation about education broadly, from K to 12 to universities, and to have three leading experts in this space to help us begin this work. I'm going to introduce them in the order that they will speak. Prudence L. Carter is the E.H. and Mary E. Pardee Professor and Dean of the Graduate School of Education at the University of California, Berkeley. Dean Carter's expertise centers on issues of youth identity and race, class and gender, urban poverty, social and cultural inequality, the sociology of education, and mixed research methods. Dean Carter is the author of Keeping It Real, School Success Beyond Black and White, and Stubborn Roots, Race, Culture, and Inequality in US and South African Schools. Before being named Dean at Berkeley, she was the Jacks Family Professor of Education and Professor of Sociology by courtesy at Stanford University. Dean Carter is an elected member of the National Academy of Education and the Sociological Research Association, and a fellow of the American Educational Research Association. She also serves on the Board of Trustees of the William T. Grant Foundation and SOAR for Youth. Pawan Dhingra is Professor of American Studies and Faculty Equity and Inclusion Officer at Amherst College. He is a former curator at the Smithsonian Institution as well. He's been published in the New York Times, CNN, and elsewhere, and his work has also been profiled and widely in the media, including in the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal. He's a multiple award-winning author whose latest book is Hyper Education: Why Good Schools, Good Grades, and Good Behavior Are Not Enough, which the author Min-Jin Lee described as, quote, a fascinating exploration that gets to the root of education obsessions. Nasima Hassan, originally from Lancashire, has worked in secondary school teaching humanities and teacher training and in strategic management and higher education. She has worked extensively overseas, supporting teachers' professional development in India, South Africa, and most recently in conjunction with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in Malaysia. She has published on the education system in South Africa, on faith schools, and on the schooling experience of British Muslims. Her doctoral thesis explored the concept of Muslim consciousness through a philosophical and political exploration of identity construction. She is co-author of Sociology of Education. So thank you all so much for being here. And with that, we're going to turn things over to Dean Carter to get us started.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Nelson, President Nelson. Thanks to the SSRC and Sage Publishing and President Ziyad Marar for having me this afternoon or morning or wherever you may be. I've been asked this question about reimagining education and schooling for multiple times now since the advent of the 2020 pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic. And so I have a few thoughts, and I want to start by saying that part of reimagining may actually be just doing what we know already from social science, but we've never fully implemented because of the lack of political will or the lack of having the critical and the right thinking and policymakers, decision makers in place, the lack of resources. So some of the things that I may say may not necessarily be that novel. And so let me just start by saying that I am moved and I have been greatly startled by the amount of disparity that has been compounded by the 2020 pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. And I want to think about something that the great Indian writer and activist Arundhati Roy has written. And I quote, she says, historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world, end of quote. These words resonated strongly with me when I first read them in the Indian Financial Times. And the 2020 COVID pandemic, in my estimation, has created an existential crisis, not only for many of us as human beings, but for our social institutions. And in my estimation, it is beckoning us to change our philosophies and praxis for public education. And I'll specifically talk about K-12 education, where most of my research resides. I am a university professor, for those who don't know me. I'm also a university administrator. And as of March of this year, I became a first grade teacher's aide. I have a 7-year-old son. And there are three things that have crossed my mind in terms of education as a social institution. First, is one of the most fundamental social institutions for socialization of us as human beings and for society building. And yet it has virtually been ignored in the US 2020 election. So that's one thing that I want to draw our attention to. The second thing that I've been thinking a lot about is how narrowly we define education and academic success in our society. And I would suggest that that has actually backed us into a corner, particularly as we think about the angst and anxiety around the so-called learning loss this year. And then thirdly, I want to talk about critically about how poorly we have utilized schools and social organizations to erode some of the most nefarious forces in our society: racism, xenophobia, homophobia, religious intolerance, and so forth. So as a sociologist and educational researcher who studies race, class, and gender inequality in schools, I have examined how US-style inequality engenders opportunity gaps, which in turn produce persistent learning disparities. Some like to refer to these as achievement gaps. I tend to prefer to think about opportunity gaps. But scores and scores of studies, decades of research from social scientists across disciplines show that to create an even chance for most learners in society, our leaders, our thinkers, our researchers must address the core needs of children and families, from jobs and income to affordable housing and healthcare, to high quality teaching and learning in culturally rich and culturally sustaining schools. All are necessary, but neither alone is sufficient to reduce the vast racial and ethnic and socioeconomic inequality today. If we think of our society as one with interconnected systems, and if one area of the ecosystem is compromised, then our society is compromised, is weakened. So I was asked the question, well, what is my dream of schooling beyond the metaphorical portal that Roy has written about? And there are three things that I want to make a point about. One, at the macro level, and one that is cross-institutional in society. Schools alone cannot solve the problems of inequities. Federal, state, and local departments of education multiple levels of divisions of health and human services and housing and development, in my estimation, must coordinate efforts in order to address the structural factors that affront many Black and Latinx and Indigenous youth, many of whom in the United States live within 200% of the poverty line. Adequate food, health, housing security, plus dynamic teaching and learning have to go together. So that's a macro level phenomena, which many actually did. Many people argue that schools should be able to do it by themselves. I am one who takes a structuralist perspective to say that schools can't do it alone. When we think about the larger ecology of inequality in our society. At the meso level within schools, we know that teaching is one of the most critical inputs. And in my dream, education decision makers would rip off a century-old facade, demolish the standardized assembly line foundation of teaching and learning, and really start afresh. Not only would the teaching profession be elevated to a higher status than it has been, but also newcomer and experienced teachers alike would be well-trained. They would become anti-racist. They would be culturally sensitive and competent cultivators of our children's hearts, minds, and souls. And surely the lessons of the pandemic have taught us some of why this matters. And believe me, I've learned much about teaching in terms of trying to support my 7-year-old. Why it matters to value our children. And in valuing our children, we value how well we train our teachers. And teachers could effectively foster educational growth among all of our students across this nation and elsewhere if they and curriculum specialists will keep abreast of what students really need to know. To have anti-racist educators, for example, they need to be steeped in anti-racist environments. And anyone who knows the work that research that I conduct knows that while I don't argue that we need integrated schools to save children of color, I will declare that separate will never be equal in terms of educational stratification, in terms of the distribution of economic and political power. So in my mind, Reimagining Schools requires us to revisit the seminal failed experiment in American education, our inability to implement deliberate and true integration to make anti-racists out of whites and others who discriminate and wield virulent acts against historically disadvantaged and racially minoritized groups. So at the individual and micro levels, then true integration has to have the ability to change the mindsets that facilitate the kind of strife and division, that produce the kinds of persons who create the fodder for the jarring images that we see flashing across our TV screens today. So my dream for K through 16 education is also to think about how we make education more for the public good. What does education do for society? And balance that more with what education does for me, the use of education as a private good. I imagine our schools as setting both those things and radically eroding past patterns of the exclusion and injustices, and facilitate the kind of mobility that we also imbue with schools as a part of their responsibility. So part of reimagination for me is just doing the right thing, doing what we already know what needs to be done, but have lacked the political will. And to conclude, because I know my time is short, I'll end where I began with Roy. And she concluded, we can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. And I, for one, can imagine an educational system that gets us closer to our capacity to be an engaged, dynamic society, committed to equity at multiple levels, committed to justice, empathic understanding across multiple lines of social distance, imparted by educators who are steeped in anti-racist and anti-classist, and have a broad way of thinking about the world and society, and a capacity to build the deepest love for learning for all of our society's learners. So that's where I'll stop, and I'll take questions later. Thank you.
That was a beautiful beginning to our conversation. And, you know, I have found that Roy essay, I think that was from maybe April, so helpful to think with. Thank you so much, Dean Carter, for those comments and remarks. We'll turn now to Dr. Dhingra.
Thank you all for this opportunity. Thank you, President Nelson, the SSRC, Sage Publishing. It's great to be in conversation with Dr. Carter and Dr. Hassan. And thanks to you all for joining us. And I like how you said, Dr. Nelson, one of the goals here is to reimagining the anchors of social life. That's a really great framing. I want to keep that in mind today and moving forward. And so speaking of schools, to reimagine schools, I think we should first talk about what we don't want. And the notion of reimagining schools was actually on the language, or at least connected to the language that Governor Cuomo actually used over the spring when in the face of remote learning, and he enlisted Bill Gates to kind of help reimagine schools for New York. And I cautioned against that in an op-ed at the time, and I want to touch upon a little bit of that right now. I think it helps kind of frame things. Past Gates initiatives have kind of this one-size-fits-all approach to kind of changing the school systems. So for instance, one of his approaches was to create small classrooms, which cost billions of dollars. And then he pushed for more assessment of teachers, which cost hundreds of millions of dollars. And neither really had much of an impact. It's not just me saying this, he himself said this publicly. And more than not having a positive impact, these kinds of approaches arguably have had a negative effect on our school children in schools in unattended ways. So parents become dissatisfied, right, with their schools more than maybe we should be. If I'm a parent, I am a parent. I'm told that, you know, big classrooms are a problem. I hear this. And of course, I'm going to complain about the size of my kids' classrooms. If I'm told my teachers need better training and assessment, then of course, respect for teachers will go down. So parents with resources, right, responded to these kind of concerns as any kind of caring parent would, that it, you know, we take matters into our own hands. Parents have turned to after-school tutoring centers and other venues, worried that if they don't, their child will not be competitive and learn enough. So my latest book, Hypereducation, explains why parents have made Kumon and Mathnasium and other after-school centers some of the fastest growing companies in the country. Asian Americans, whites, African Americans, and others are taking advantage of these spaces, even when they are in great schools and well-resourced schools and should be satisfied with the education that their kids are getting, but they aren't. The results of this trend are actually quite significant. Teachers I spoke to see increased stress and anxiety among students as young as third graders, no longer just among college students or even high school students. An education arms race is at play with heightened competition. Kids complain of undue demands. And this trend that was happening even before remote learning and the onset of the coronavirus has just been accelerating now due to the lack of trust parents have in remote learning that we're all kind of part of. I have two kids, you may hear them in the background at some point. So the educational sector outside of schools, right, is growing and impacting on schools in ways that benefit some kids individually, but hurt the collective. Educational inequality grows, racial disparities grow. And so I agree with a lot of what Dr. Carter has articulated. Instead of such top-down approaches, we need to listen to teachers as they say that we need to think about school and education happening outside of school walls. We need to think about the social and emotional well-being of students, right? Part of the response to reimagining schools is actually reimagining education, not just schools. Schools cannot be seen as separate, right, from the environments in which they are in. So what does that actually mean, right? We need to support social workers. We need more mental health counselors. We need investment in arts programs. We need advanced courses, right? All of that makes a big difference. At the same time, right, we should look for instances when under-resourced schools and children are excelling and support them. And important to keep in mind, and this is speaking to any kind of policy persons out there, so we can't always scale up what is working well, right? We like to think that we can. That's a great opportunity. That should be a great mechanism. But the context matters so much, right, that we should learn from this and apply positive lessons where we can, but not assume that there's any kind of magic bullet out there. And one other key point as we kind of reimagine schools is that I'd like to see more compassion, right, baked into the school system. I think that's really pronounced right now in our current moment. So I wear a mask, right, in order to protect, you know, Dr. Nelson, and she wears a mask to protect Dr. Carter, and so on, right? We're doing this as we understand that we're part of a collective. Our school system, however, does not necessarily teach our students to think of themselves as part of a collective, right? Parents push their kids as they seek admissions into universities or other kind of opportunities. And we need to reevaluate what kind of priorities we want, what we think are most significant. And as we think about higher education, I'll quickly say a few words about this with my administrator hat on in terms of as a diversity, inclusion, and equity officer. To have a fair place to work, one we can take pride in, we need to make DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, inherent throughout the entire system, right? Think about it in terms of our enrollments, our student services, our campus police, our faculty hiring, retention, promotions, trustee, everything. And realizing that each of these kind of three components, diversity, inclusion, and equity, have significant but different relationships to that proper workplace. Diversity is about representation, right? And at the most basic level. We even think about that in terms of demographics, if nothing else. But oftentimes that's where we stop, but that actually should be where we start. If we think about once we have a diverse workforce, let's say that we do, what does it actually mean? Well, inclusion is about the culture of the workplace. We need to think about what kind of culture we want and not just ask people to assimilate into the culture that's there. We should be rethinking our mentoring programs and consider peer mentoring. We should not just talk about how people get promotions in terms of mentoring or something like that, but also talk about the hidden traumas that faculty experience and others experience, like imposter syndrome, or how to feel connected to one's work over time. Equity is about the processes we put in place that uplift marginalized groups and ensure equal opportunities and outcomes. So you can think about it in terms of stages, right? Diversity, inclusion, and equity, but you can't have one without the other, and you can't sustain them without all three. And the last thing I'll just quickly say, because I'm running out of time, is that diversity, equity, and inclusion is not just thinking about faculty of color or women or LGBTQ individuals or all of the intersections across these groups, right? Instead, it's about thinking about the university from the standpoint of those who don't fit the institution's assumptions. We need to do that not just to attend to those people, but to unpack what are our assumptions and then rebuild in a productive way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hope there'll be lots of conversation about the collective and indeed about where you ended on institutional assumptions. I think a lot of this is about both spoken and unspoken institutional assumptions that we hold as parents, as teachers, as educators and the like. Thank you very much. Dr. Hassan, delighted to turn things over to you now. And we're gonna share, you're gonna put her slides up. I think Lou's gonna do that.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you to the organisers for including me in this event. I'm speaking predominantly from the British context, but I do want to acknowledge that a huge amount of research that I've been part of and that I've read in terms of my own schooling has been heavily influenced by the American context. So it's really enlightening to hear from the previous speakers in terms of what is the current situation. The theme of my input really looks at moving from the margins to the centre and to pick up the language that was used by Ziyad, I think, to move beyond analysis to impact. And there are three key areas I want to look at when we reimagine social institutions, particularly schooling. So if I can have the next slide, please. They are a teacher training. I'm going to start with a teacher training, which is one of the key kind of foundational elements of reimagining what schools may be in terms of anti-racist education. And the reason why I want us to embrace the moving from the margins to the centre philosophy is because there's a body of literature, pedagogy and research already there in place that can shape teacher training in terms of curriculum design at university, the education programs at undergraduate and postgraduate level. We are really rich in that research. We're rich in academics who can inform that from the UK perspective and from a global perspective. And I captured just some of their work on these slides. We also have a wealth of pupil-centered teaching and learning resources that can help embed what maybe has been used in schools in this month. So we're still in October, and in the UK, believe it or not, we have this thing called Black History Month, where we try to give a nod towards greater inclusion and greater diversity. But the importance is it's not just a month, you know. Embedding real practice in terms of teacher training means that you will have a holistic year-round delivery. So teacher training is the first strand, then that links to curriculum, and obviously schooling, we're focusing on schooling, but as I mentioned, there's the research is already there to inform higher education design. And then I'll look briefly at school policies. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? So in terms of teacher training, this is really about diversity in terms of role models, and we do need to start from that position. Yeah? One of the key areas in terms of teacher training is making sure in the anti-racist school that pupils value and appreciate that racial literacy is as important as literacy. So we have a national literacy strategy as we go into our secondary school and into post-16 options. Literacy is front and center as a key priority. So when we talk about racial literacy, what is it we're talking about? Well, it's just simple words like understanding identity and belonging, and protest and misrepresentation, Black activism, South Asian heritage, which is a big area, a growth area now, invisibility and visibility. So myself as a Muslim woman on this panel, you know, that is a focus of visibility that is important.
Nasima, we seem to have lost you. So maybe you can maybe let's try turning off your camera to see if we can just hear your audio, and that gives us a little bit more bandwidth. Nasima, are you there? Lou, can you take the slides down? Maybe that'll help as well. We've lost her altogether. Okay. Well, we will get Dr. Hassan back soon, hopefully. But there's already lots of questions, and I wanted to. The question I was going to ask first, and we can go back to Dr. Hassan when she arrives, is about how to create. How would you imagine or suggest creating a shared understanding that education is, as an institution, is an anchor, to use Prudence's words, to sort of open up the visibility to all that education is necessary for in society. I think we've really lost that. And this, of course, is linked to Pawan's observations about the loss of education being a collective endeavor. And then slightly related to that, we talk so much about inequality and opportunity gaps, Prudence, to use your word. But I think what we've learned in this moment and come to see is also the opportunity hoarding, right? So that part, one way of describing what Pawan's recent book is about, and what we're seeing in the education pods and things that are necessarily emerging. I mean, one completely understands why people are trying to sort of get opportunities for their children in the face of what Prudence described as a kind of panic around learning loss. But how can we sort of, I guess, shine a light on how the opportunity gaps create opportunity hoarding in a way that really to the deficit of to a collective and to the deficit of how education benefits society in whole.
Let me just say that as I'm listening to the terms and the concepts that we come up with as social scientists, oftentimes we're talking about the same thing. We're using different language and they actually overlap quite a bit. So when we talk about opportunity hoarding, part of that is quite related to the philosophical belief and the perspective about education as mainly a private good. It is about what it can do for me and my children to make us more competitive in society. And subscribing to the master cultural frame about social mobility means being competitive with others. And part of that opportunity hoarding has to do with that competition, right? And so I think part of the thing that we have lost in our society, and the reason there is such heightened anxiety, and this is where K-12 and higher education interrelate, they interact. I believe higher education is implicated in how it has created, particularly among selective colleges and universities, a sense of scarcity. And when you have a sense of scarcity for the few selective seats, 200,000 or so, and millions of students, then you have this panic, this desire to make sure you get enough to put yourself in the best position to get into one of those higher elite institutions. And that means colluding in inequality in fundamental ways. That means not caring about integration because you're going to buy a house in a socioeconomically and racially segregated neighborhood because it's linked to so-called good schools because the test scores are high. Not understanding that the notion of good is very narrow there. So I think part of that hoarding is very much linked to how our institutions have also created an understanding of what success means in our society. And that's where I began, that we have a very narrow understanding of the use of education. And part of that is structured by our institutions. And so it just trickles down to the family level, to the individual level. And then it's hard to break out of. So I think that a solution is going to start with how higher education actually expands its net, which is why affirmative action is an important thing to talk about here today as well. How higher education can diffuse that competition, and how we can create a sense of that there is enough for us all.
Thank you. So Pawan, why don't you just maybe offer a brief response and then we'll go to Dr. Hassan, who's back with us.
Okay, yeah, I understand. I'm going to hear Dr. Hassan's comments as well. And I think what Prudence said is exactly right. The trickle down, if you will, of how selective colleges kind of understand themselves and we understand them and their role in society factors down not just the high school and middle school, but also down to third graders and preschool and everything else. And, you know, we can talk about this in terms of, you know, liberalism and, you know, capitalism and all these kind of major concepts, but there are some practical things we can do to help kind of ease the tensions that about entering these selective universities that will get filtered down. And if it gets into parents' mindsets and teachers' mindsets, then we can actually have a real impact on youth. I will be very brief because I want to hear Dr. Hassan, but also I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Welcome back, Dr. Hassan.
Hi, sorry about that. Thank you, guys. My key point was to make my emphasis was to make a point about teacher training being our starting point, because they will be the diversity role models, and the fact that there was already a huge body of research which can inform education programs in higher education. So previously I've worked in higher education, I've helped and supported the design of those curriculums. We are now hearing voices from the global south, we are more representative, and that will in turn have a positive impact on racial literacy. And I think that's where I was cut out about what is racial literacy. There was a Channel 4 program, which is one of our main channels in this country, which had a program called The School That Tried to End Racism. And all that program really tried to do was to illustrate that lots of the non-white children already had good racial literacy and all of the white children had no racial literacy. Well, we really didn't need the funding to go to a program to tell us that. What we needed was a diverse production team who could have told the first person who saw that idea in an email, let's not bother with that. So representation in terms of our teacher training is key. If we could move on to the next slide, thank you. Curriculum then looks at how we implement those creative voices. And this is about interrogating why our curriculum is so white and who are the people that we are reading. So to give you an example, when we study English language and English literature in our secondary schools, we have this whole section that's called voices from other cultures. And within that section, we would have South African literature. Well, I'm Indian South African, but I'm also British. So that is, my argument is that that's also British culture, because Britain is very, very diverse now, and it's within that diversity that you have a celebration of lots of cultures. But when you have an examination board that distinguishes and identifies this is British culture and this is other culture, in effect othering and misrepresenting, then what you have is a real challenge with those very young people understanding the value that is placed on the literature from other cultures. So we do need to interrogate the lens through which our history is taught. So again, Black History Month right now, unfortunately, huge amount of focus will be on the transatlantic slave trade from the perspective of the empire, right? It's high time that we did think about and look very carefully at the riches of literature and culture that came from the African perspective, that looked at this period of history from a completely different perspective. And what is it that we learn about ourselves? And that, again, this very week, the number of discussions that have taken place regarding what the actual anti-racist curriculum would look like in terms of a history curriculum. So obviously celebrating the positive features of our history, and again I'm referring to, in the British context, British history, but also having a real positive understanding about our role around the world as the global policeman as well. Okay, so onto my last slide, looks then at how policies are implemented. So this is now how organizations which will make value judgments about schools, government think tanks, look at how school policies implement these key areas. So Ofsted has a very specific role. Ofsted obviously is, works on behalf of the government to tell us the way in which our schools are performing. And if we follow through in terms of moving from the margin to the centre in terms of valuing the contributions from different cultures, then Ofsted will again assess that report on schools being inadequate in this area and place a huge importance on them improving their practice. That may be the route that we take to really move, again, using the words from Ziyad at the beginning, from analysis to impact. There are real issues around racialized value judgments, which a non-diverse staff may pick on, which has real issues for our pupils in schools, and those are the key areas that we need to address in terms of representation. Just to conclude, the issue is multi-layered, multi-complex. As we all know, as was mentioned by Dean Prudence right at the beginning, these intersections of race and class are really crucial to understand. And I think it's, regardless of where you are in the globe, those are what impact our families and our pupils. And if we really have a secure understanding of that, so even before I get to teacher training, I want to make sure that our pupils are living in safe homes, and that they're living in homes that are, in areas where they feel well and safe, and that their families have jobs which nurture them and develop them, and they are not, crushed under the weight of zero contract, or unable to, function through the day because of the incapacity that is enforced upon them because of hunger. We have a phenomenal campaign right now taking place around child poverty during the holiday period. These are real issues, and we have to start from strong foundations, and those issues are parcel of the anti-racist curriculum. Thank you, and apologies for the break in transmission.
No problem. It's a regular part of our new virtual world. So
Sure.
we have an extraordinary number of questions, but I want to give you each the opportunity to maybe speak to each other. So let's take, a few minutes to do that, and then we'll try to go to some of these really rich and interesting questions that we have. So any questions of each other or comments, reflections?
Well, I
Pawan?
personally,
Oh, okay, Prudence, yeah.
no, I was just saying my preference. I don't want to. I would just love to engage with the audience, and then that way we engage with each other. So
Okay, very good.
Yeah.
We can proceed in that way. And I hope that we can pick up this piece around curriculum and around the pressure on schools to be an entire social welfare system, which are things that I think came up in some of the presentations. Okay, so my question is for all of the speakers. We in developing countries have been looking at the education system of developed countries with great appreciation and admiration because of the liberal and egalitarian values inculcated in students. But recent hype in the West, in particular regarding racism, religious intolerance, Islamophobia, and social dichotomies and dual standards, reflect that the Western education system has badly failed in inculcating values of equality, fraternity, and liberty, irrespective of nation and color. Why is the modern education system failed in this respect?
I'll start, but then let others take over. I don't think that I think it's a great question, and I think it's a fair question about how well the developed world, if you will, education system has fared. And I don't think one of the themes I think from this presentations today is that the education system is not separate from the rest of the ills in a society, right? So the ills that plague a society are going to manifest in a school system, maybe even be more pronounced in a school system, because that is an arm really of the state that kind of uses a lot of the assumptions we carry and tries to kind of teach them and siphon them down to children. So unless we as I say this is the US speaking specifically, right, are able to address some of our endemic problems around whether it be race, class inequality, intolerance, individualism, hyper-individualism, our school system won't be able to necessarily be highly different and countercultural in that way, right? The school system works as a cultural agent. And so I think so. It's not about changing schools, right? It's about changing the broader processes.
And I will just say, I'll go back to the second point I made today, is that I really think that the major failed social experiment in the United States, particularly since that's what I know, and I've watched it in South Africa as well in my research, is really, we've got to desegregation and then it receded, but we never really got to integration. And part of it is what we're seeing as people who've been so isolated from each other across the country. And people who have not one iota of respect for difference, but are very homophilous in their orientation. So I don't necessarily mean there are many people, I'm not an orthodox about integration. I know that was one of the questions, because I know historically Black and Brown and Indigenous folks have been able to enhance their capacities in some ways. I believe in the value of Black teachers, Black educators, Indigenous educators, and so forth, as Dr. Hassan has talked about in terms of the proliferation of anti-racist education. You also need to desegregate and diversify the teaching profession. But the exposure of white children, particularly affluent and white, and those who are privileged in different societies, to children who are different from themselves and vice versa, I mean, that's part of what academic learning and success means. It's not just about the technical. It's not just about math, social studies, and science, and English arts, or whatever the language. It's also about your ability to be civically engaged with others. And I think that because we don't have schools that mirror our society, that's what's undermining the very social fabric and the political fabric.
Thank you. Dr. Hassan?
Make a point about, I wasn't sure that I was ready to condemn the education in the West completely. I want to make the case for character education, which I see is increasingly has got a strong footing in many of our academies, which are the newer schools. So an education system which actually teaches values alongside the curriculum is an option in terms of a way forward. So both the speakers did talk about compassion and kindness and having a love for each other and stuff like that. And we maybe those are conversations that we should have anyway, regardless of the global pandemic. So part of my work does secure the place of value and character education in terms of provision from early years right through higher education. And if we value that in schools alongside the curriculum, then maybe that's heading in the right direction.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask two questions about students. So bear with me. One is, during this pandemic, students are, and one might question the premise of the questions. During this pandemic, students are demotivated, depressed, and still maladjusted. Apart from this, digitalization of education has resulted in wide socioeconomic disparities. The democratic nature of education is lost. What are your comments on this? So that's the first. The second, in the midst of reimagining schools, what are ways in which we can engage marginalized youth of color and reimagining how the world sees, defines, and recognizes them? Are there spaces where you believe outside of schools reimagining work can be done? Prudence, do you want to?
Well, I'll take the second one. I am so hardened by the participation of racially minoritized youth in political and social movements right now. I mean, in fact, much of what's happened across the world, much of it has been led by youth energy, youth vitality, youth thought. I mean, so one of the things that I don't think our schools have done are all bad. In fact, many young people have been able to engage and build political knowledge and education inside and outside of schools. And it just depends on where they've grown up. And so I want to just give a shout out to young people who are the core leaders to some of the political movements. I mean, they have been in the streets in various cities for days and days and days. And so that's young students to young adults. And so I would acknowledge that. In terms of the issue around the COVID-19 and all of this anxiety about the digital divide, I think, what this pandemic has done is just basically illuminate more for us what kind of inequality we already had. It's not new. It was always there. It's illuminated it and perhaps it's exacerbated it. For me, I am more interested right now, and it's not probably a politically savory thing to say for many, but I really just want to make sure our children are taken care of in terms of their social and emotional well-being. I have no problem with us having a year. What if it's a gap year? In my own personal life, I have just I'm trying to follow my son's curiosity. I mean, and maybe that is privilege talking, but he is very resistant to being in front of a screen every day. And at 7 years old, why do I have to worry about the fact that he may not read as well by the end of first grade? Personally, I don't think I learned to read until I was second grade. So I wasn't I wasn't a fast achiever in that way, but I did okay. I turned out okay. So we're lifelong learners. What if we prolong it? Why do the standards have to be the status quo under a pandemic? That's the question I'd ask.
Thank you. Dr. Dhingra?
I really liked how you ended that, Prudence, with why the standards we just take them for granted, as if somehow not only are they just taken granted as normal, we're taken for granted as natural. And that is they're clearly constructed, and we know that, but we don't take that, we don't bother to question that. And now, if we're going to use this as an opportunity, then let's use it as an opportunity to re-question a lot of the things we're taking for granted around these lines. And the part of the question was, how do we connect with students who are unmotivated? I think, and I write a lot about this, and that one of the best things we need to do is, as educators and as parents, is realize where are the students, and we have to meet them where they're at, not just teach them where we think they should be. And we have to make the knowledge we're trying to teach them connect to their personal lives. So let's not pretend we're not in a pandemic. Let's not pretend that the content is just the same. Let's not pretend that we're not learning virtually, not just in terms of how I teach, but actually what I'm teaching. And this becomes another space to kind of ask ourselves, what do we really want first graders or eighth graders or 12th graders to really know? And then not ask teachers to reinvent knowledge by any means, but figure out what is the kernel I'm trying to get across here. How can I make that relevant to students so they feel connected to the material and become motivated? And this issue of the democratic nature is being lost as a result of this digital divide. I mean, there's no answer. I don't have any clear answer to that in 1 minute. I'm not going to pretend to. I really appreciate the question, and this is kind of, I think, what's guiding SSRC here. The democratic natures are being threatened, and we have to reimagine our institutions across the board to recover that.
Thank you, Dr. Hassan.
There's a real acute focus on poverty, and the fact that poverty has gone unrecognized and unaddressed by global economies, and there's been a huge imbalance where we focused on the super rich and the contributions of the super rich, how the super rich can have an impact. And poverty in a holistic sense has never really been addressed. There was a question in the chat about poverty in Africa as well, and why is the situation continue there? Well, that's because that acute poverty has never been addressed. So now we look at Britain, UK, Europe, and America, and there you find, because of the global pandemic, those below the poverty line are the ones who are suffering the most. So we do need to just understand and step back and address that first and foremost. It is building a house on sand to try and reimagine education whilst the issue of poverty in our country is continues unresolved, and it's as simple as that. In terms of the second question regarding how are marginalised communities responding, there's a great role for supplementary schooling to complement and enhance what should be taking place in school. So simple learning around what is resilient practice right now and growth mindset, and it's okay not to be okay. Or believe it or not, these are lessons that are actually taking place in schools now, but they have started in community settings, with homes online, with families, because that's the real issue now, not the learning loss. And again, the learning loss is not something that's been measured in terms of an outcome. There hasn't been an examination to give us the data to provide evidence of a learning loss. There's just a few weeks where children weren't in school. And really, in the bigger picture, as long as they were healthy and safe, should we really focus on that? I'm not sure.
Thank you. So I'm mindful of time. I just want to pose one last question that's a little bit related to Dr. Dhingra's comment about thinking about schools as also being about social workers and nurses, and that all of the all of the people, in addition to teachers, who sort of make education happen. One thing that we didn't discuss, of course, is a social role that is now in schools, which is policing, and the sort of policing, the way that policing takes place in schools, and is creating, if my former Columbia colleague Carla Shedd was here, she would want us to, invoke the sort of school to prison pipeline and the kind of carceral continuum. Dr. Hassan, I don't imagine this is a distinctly US thing, but I would love just some final observations on the kind of militarization of schools that has been turned to as a way of trying to fix the failures of education. Prudence?
Well, so yeah, I actually, some colleagues and I wrote an article some years ago about you can't fix what you don't look at, looking at racial disproportionality and discipline and suspensions in school. And certainly that's connected to the carceral continuum, as Professor Shedd talks about. And so, I will put it out there, schools are not jails, but that's what they've become. And not all schools. So I think it's important to qualify. We are talking about mostly urban, racially and ethnically minoritized dominant schools, like where the majority of the kids are also from lower income backgrounds who get policed by the state via the institution of schooling. And that's a problem in American society. Not only does it disaffect, but it also threatens the well-being of students. And I think we already know from the Department of Justice's analysis and such that is something that has to be rectified and ameliorated in our society. So going into high school, but some of the issues, I also think you can't ignore the fact that the ecological issues that surround schools permeate those school walls. And so there has to be a balance in attendance to the issues that will come into the school walls that are the consequence of the social troubles and ills that afflict certain communities. So how do we balance those things? And what is the correct policy decisions? Well, I think one is, yeah, we don't need police in schools, but we do need supports for schools to ensure the overall and holistic well-being of our children.
Thank you. Dr. Hassan, I think I interrupted you here. Please.
That's okay. You're absolutely right that this is definitely an issue in our context as well. There's a real culture of surveillance on our pupils, particularly in terms of the prevent agenda on our Muslim pupils, which is heavily racialized. So based on what they look like, where they live, what their name is, who they interact with, the mosque that they attend, these are all indicators, shall we say, of certain behaviors, and in particular focus on the biggest underachieving group in this country, which is this generic term, which is used, black boys. So the policing of black boys and their behaviors is a huge area of focus in schools. And that's where I talk about the racial literacy being such an important thing, because those value judgments about racialized behaviors, if you understand a culture, if you understand cultural behaviors, if you have insight and education about the ways in which different groups operate with each other, then really that will address in a more considered way, shall we say. All these issues are connected. It's a lack of representation in terms of school leadership, and it's also surveillance culture in our schools that our young people need to be policed in that environment. Hugely problematic, very, 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 very alarming, and it really is an area that we need to monitor in terms of presence. Right now, we don't physically have those police officers in schools. That would be an absolute nightmare if that happened. We really need to think carefully about where we're heading though.
Well, welcome to our nightmare, Dr. Hassan. We
Right.
certainly have them in US schools. Dr. Dhingra.
Sorry.
No, those are both great points. We have to understand that what's kind of behind this, the issues of militarization in our schools, is this notion, is the prevalence of anti-Blackness. It's kind of baked into our school systems in ways that we sometimes just take for granted. Even the ways we compliment other students, right, is because they're seen as somehow different than Blacks. And we have to tackle anti-Blackness in our police systems, in our government, in our media, and in our schools to kind of get to uncover some of this. Because as Dr. Hassan said, she's exactly right. The issue is not just militarization. It's not like we just get rid of the police and we end up replacing it with something else as another kind of surveillance. So we have to ask not just how do we discipline, but what are the rules behind disciplining in the first place? What are the assumptions behind proper and improper behavior in the first place? So not just how we kind of handle behavior, which is oftentimes what policing and conversations become, like the use of force or something else, and instead move to a conversation, what's behind our idea of proper versus improper behavior, and when you unpack that, you do see notions of anti-Blackness as guiding this and other forms of kind of assumptions and privilege.
Yeah, so Jennifer Lee's work on the inverse of stereotype threat, I think, helps us to understand that as well. I wish that we could go on and on. There are now 80 questions in the Q&A that we can't possibly get to from nearly the 1,000 people who are joining us on Facebook and here on Zoom. Thank you all so much, Dr. Prudence Carter, Dr. Pawan Dhingra, Dr. Nasima Hassan, for getting us started on this really important conversation about transforming institutions, and be it a portal. We use a lot of metaphors, there's but I think what we're clear about is that there's a choice here, that we face a choice, and that this moment really requires that we make choices. So thank you for this incredibly challenging and inspiring conversation, and for spending time with us this afternoon. Thank you all for joining us, and I want to thank the teams at the SSRC and Sage Publishing for all that they did to make this conversation possible. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.